Hello and welcome to part 4 of our continuing series, Basic Training with Premiere Elements. I'm your host, Steve Grisetti, co-founder of MoviePix.com, and let's continue with our series. In part 1, we created a project. Part 2, we brought media into the project. Part 3, we actually placed that media onto our timeline. And now in part 4, we'll take a look at transitions and adding transitions to that media. Now, transitions may seem pretty basic. Most people think, well, what the heck? We've got transitions here. I go to the Edit tab and I go to Transitions and I select, and I've got my choice of about 75 transitions here that I can choose. I just drag them on and that's all there is to it, right? Well, there actually is a little more to it than that. Once you understand transitions and what's going on, you'll not only be able to create some of your own transitions and effects, but you'll also be able to customize them, and you'll understand when things kind of go unexpectedly wrong with them. And I'll show you that and how to work around that also. Okay, so we've got our basic timeline here and we'll add some transitions to it. But before we do, I want to point out that there are actually 3 different ways, at least, to add transitions to clips in Premiere Elements. The simplest has to do with fading in and fading out your video. Now, if I wanted to fade in this clip, there's a very simple way to do it, and that is that I can right click, I can go to the Fade menu, and I can choose Fade in Audio, Fade in Video, Fade in Audio and Video, and Fade out Audio, Video, and both. In this case, why don't I choose Fade in Audio and Video? And we can also choose a Fade out Audio and Video. You can apply more than one of these. And I want you to take a look at what's happening when I do that. If you take a look down here at your clip in the timeline, you see that this point, this is called a keyframe. A keyframe has been added, and this keyframe goes, in the case of opacity here, it goes from 100% down to 0. In the case of audio, it goes from 1 decibel down to 0. Now, keyframes, of course, can be removed as well as added, and I'm just going to remove these here by clicking on them and pressing delete. So we no longer have a fade out here at the end. That's the way you remove a fade. We have a fade in at the beginning, but when we get to this clip, we just have a basic cut. And transitions are divided into a couple of groups here: video transitions and audio transitions. Now, audio transitions we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about today. They're basically a crossfade. And you know what? Most people can't hear the difference between constant gain and constant power, so it's entirely up to you which one you use. But basically know that the only audio transition for the most part is a crossfade. Video transitions, on the other hand, we got between 70 and 75 of them. You'll notice they're in little categories. If you go to the filter drop down, you can see each of the categories for your video transitions. There's another way to quickly call up a transition, and that is to use the quick search box here. There's one in the effects panel too. I can type, for instance, zoom, and just bring up all of my transitions that have to do with zooming. I can put push in here and it'll immediately bring up my push transition. If I clear that out, I can see all of my transition library again. Applying a transition is pretty simple. We just drag the transition onto our clips, and there's our transition. Now, this transition is 1 second by default, but in Premiere Elements, almost nothing needs to be at default if you don't want it to be. Now, you can open up the transition customization menu simply by double clicking on this. So you could have clicked Edit Transition button here, but it's easier usually when you're working on your video to just double click here on a transition, and here is our little properties menu for transition properties. Now, you can see in this case there aren't a lot of customization options. Sometimes there are some few, sometimes there are more. In this particular case, our transition, if you look at it, is a flip, and so it rolls to a gray background and then it opens up on the next clip. So some of our options include, if I click this custom button, what's that background color going to be? I can make it any color I want. So there are usually a lot of options for your transitions. You almost never have to use them as they are. There's also the reverse, and the reverse will take your transition. For instance, if your transition is a push that slides your new video in from left to right, you can switch it, make it go from right to left. In this particular case, You won't see a lot of differences in reverse. It just has to do with the direction the flip turns. Now by default I said transitions are 1 second long, and you can see we have a duration up here. It's right now set to 1 second and 0 frames. We could change numerically the length here for our transition, or we could change it right here simply by stretching our transition longer, like as if to untrim it. Now suddenly I have almost a 2 second long transition, simply by making it longer. It now moves slower and it lasts longer. But I want to teach you something about how these transitions work that can save you a lot of headaches later on. And this is kind of important to know. And that is, I'm just going to remove this transition here for a second so you can look. If you look at the end of my clips, you'll see that they have a little corner knob. So can you see a little corner triangle on the corner of each one, at the end of one clip and at the beginning of another? That says that this is the end of the clip. It's not been trimmed in any way. Okay, if I trim it, that disappears. And so this is the end of this clip, and this is the beginning of this clip. Nothing has been trimmed away. Now, why is that relevant? Well, that is relevant because it affects how your transition behaves. So if I double click here to bring up my transition menu, and I go here to show timeline, this will show me what's going on with my transition. And this little diagonal line on here indicates that my transition is being built artificially. What does that mean? Well, you can see that my transition overlaps the end of clip number 1 and the beginning of clip number 2. Now that means in order for it to build the transition, Premiere Elements has to have some video that comes before the clip on video 2 to mix the two together, right? And it needs video beyond the end of clip number 1 to create, again, the transition where both clips are on at the same time. Now this particular transition, there's not a lot of that going on where both clips are on at the same time. Let's grab another transition so you can see a better example of it. This is the tumble away transition. We'll just apply it. Again, you can just place it right over top of the other transition and it will replace it. Now in this case, what happens here, and again we'll open up the timeline and you can see the transition timeline. We've got those diagonal lines. What those diagonal lines tell us is that the program could not find extra footage to use to create the transition. So what it had to do was use a freeze frame. And you can see it if you look really closely. Look at video clip 1 here. The woman gets to this point. We can see her shoulder, and as the clip continues to transition, she's frozen there. See the girl on the rocking board here? As we go before the clip, during the transition period, she is frozen on that rocking board. Well, that's just fine. It's nice that the program compensates for us, but we often don't want that. It becomes kind of jarring to see that in a transition, to see things suddenly freeze for a moment. So how do you get rid of it? Well, the simplest way to get rid of it is to give your video enough room beyond the end of your clip to build that transition. In other words, this is a 1 second transition, so I need half a second, or about 15 frames beyond this cut from video 1 for it to build its transitional segment. Likewise, video 2, I need about 15 frames before that to build that transition. I'll show you what I do. So I just take this and I trim back video 1 to right about the beginning of the transition, and I let go. You notice what happened? The transition and everything slides over, we ripple over. And I'm going to do the same thing with video 2. I'm going to just trim it to about the end of the transition, and when I let go, the clip moves in there. And now when I look at the Properties panel timeline, again I opened that by clicking on this little stopwatch, I see no hash marks. I see a nice smooth transition from one video to the other. And we can look at that. If we were to play back the clip, we can see that now the video never stops moving. Even throughout the transition, the characters are moving the whole way through the transition. So that's the thing to remember. This area here, this transitional segment, is called head and tail material. You need about half a second, depending on how long your transition is, of course. You need about half a second of extra material beyond the in point of clip B and beyond the out point of clip A for the program to build the transitional segment. And as long as you're aware of that, you'll have no problems at all. You won't be surprised by characters suddenly freeze framing in the middle here. And that's an extra special high-end tip there from your friends at MoviePix.com. And that should conclude part 4 of our 8-part series. I hope you'll stick with us through the whole series. We've got some fun things ahead for you, and we'll get you up and running with Premiere Elements. I'm Steve Grisetti from MoviePix.com. Thanks for joining me. See you soon.